welcome to Spotlights. This is the podcast for the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. And as usual, I'm your host, Sam Mickey. And in this episode, instead of the normal format of interviewing a particular guest, I'm digging through some old episodes we have, since we have about 40 at this point, and kind of remixing them based on topics. So, catching some stuff that might have slipped through the cracks and presenting it in a new way. So the theme for this episode will be critical theory and critical race theory in particular. And these are important theories for the study of religion, also for the study of the environment, so certainly for the field of religion and ecology. And of course, if you've been paying attention to the news much in this last year or so, 2020, 2021, then you know that critical race theory has been very prominent in the news and is very controversial and largely left undefined, or its definitions are very vague or unclear. So I thought it would be helpful to bring together a couple voices that have defined critical theory and critical race theory for us. And first, we'll have Celina Osuna, the Assistant Director of the Desert Humanities Initiative at Arizona State University. And she'll tell us a little bit about critical theory in general, what it means for philosophy, for environmental humanities. And then we'll pass it off to Tyler Tully, a doctoral candidate in religious studies at the University of Oxford. And he'll tell us about his experience of critical theory and get more specific about critical race theory, which is a little different than critical theory, and he'll explain why for us. So to begin, I'll pass it off to Celina to tell us a little bit about critical theory. So I'm wondering, anytime I talk to somebody on this podcast that is engaging with critical theory, I'm always like, could you please tell us what's critical theory, and how might some of these questions of gender and race or species kind of play into what that theory is about? Break it down, because especially our audience, we have some folks who maybe never really engaged with critical theory on its own terms, and they hear it a
Yeah,
little, and people kind of think, oh, anything that's critical is critical theory. It's it's a very specific kind of thing.
it is a really, I will say it's a very specific kind of thing. And the more I find myself in circles outside of critical theory as well, you do start to realize, no, there's critical race theory. I have a friend and scholar, Jerome Clark, he studies critical Dene theory, right? Which is like of the Navajo people. So just like understanding that in itself, having that giant umbrella is, I think it stems from something like scholars were really trying to work hard to think through the lineages of mainly continental philosophy. Um, but I think the work that it has cut out for it now is really understanding where that thought and those lineages can intersect with things like race and culture and identity a bit more. Um, when I explain critical theory just in a very basic way to anyone who's either like not in the academy or my student, like to my students, I do tend to oversimplify it and go, it's kind of a fancy name for philosophy of like the 20th, 21st century, which is that's a very, very broad and very oversimple explanation. But I think it helps them get past this like critical theory. It sounds like an intense label. I'll just put it that way, right? It's like an intent, you're critical and theory together. It sounds intense. And so somehow philosophy seems more esoteric and approachable in some ways. So I do that, but beyond that, I think for me, the critical theory that I try to engage with helps me think through the problems I come up against in my research. And so for me, like I was saying, like multiplicity is a problem. Multiplicity is more of a solution than a problem, but working through the problem of saying the desert is something that I do in the book. Like I intentionally do not, as many times as I can catch it, am not saying the desert. And even as somebody who's trying to write that, like we should say deserts, like add an S, right? Put an S on there, or desert places, or even though I know that, I still catch myself saying the desert. And it's because it's so ingrained in our consciousness, it's like pop culture, everything. I mean, around here in Arizona, people say all the time, like, oh yeah, I was out in the desert this weekend, or hey, you want to go out to the desert? And like, we're in a desert, like we're in, and it's funny, right? Because critical theory, one of my favorite things about critical theory, and also maybe the most frustrating, is the love of language that exists. And so you have like French, German philosophers who are translated, right? So there's there's always that problem of translation, but they do tend to engage in a very intense way with specific words and wordplay. Wittgenstein was really famous for doing that. Deleuze is famous for doing that. And after you read Deleuze and Guattari and you read, okay, no more either or, right? No more either or, it's gonna be both and. For me, as grad student, that really did something, because I'm a big believer in simultaneity. I'm a big believer in like possibilities. And so, yeah, okay, it's both and. Like there is this thing, the desert, that is this abstraction, this like homogenous abstraction that's almost anything you want it to be. It can be where you go to Burning Man and do whatever you want and have this liberation, this fun drug-fueled liberation. Or it can be the void. It can be the wasteland. It can be where these nuclear testing sites find themselves somehow, right, and become radioactive. So that abstraction does exist, right, as well as the different deserts that exist. And so when I did move to Arizona, I thought, I'm coming back from Scotland. It's gonna feel like home. It's the desert. There's mountains, like big horizons, all the tick the boxes. And then I got here and it's easily 10 degrees hotter. It like during the summers, it's not something you get used to. I mean, it's 118 all week is the high, right? This is all week. And I've gotten used to knowing that it just won't cool off until October. Like I just know that now, and that wasn't the case in El Paso. And in terms of saguaros, we don't have saguaros native to El Paso. They're native to the Sonoran Desert. So I got here and it was like, I feel like I was as stunned as anybody else coming here who wasn't from the Sonoran Desert, right? It was just like, whoa, they're real. I'd only seen them in films, and sometimes in films depicting El Paso. So like trying to understand these complications of representation or misrepresentation and break them down into multiple. And so I find a power in language, I've chained myself to literature and the arts, and I'm happy about that. And I think in literature specifically, we have power of imagination and power of language as well, which is what these theorists are working with. And so really trying, how can I embrace that? Okay, let's get rid of the definitive article. We'll not say the desert. It sounds cool. I probably will slip and say it, as time goes on. But I always it always reminds me of that, the America song, the 70s song.
Yeah.
Desert with horse with no name.
Yeah, been
right?
through the desert on a horse with
Been
no
through the
name.
desert on a horse with no name. And so it's like, that's the desert. And when you picture that, you picture probably dunes, mountains, I don't know. But if I say a desert, you might be like, well, which one? Right. And so it's a small switch, but it's not. Maybe in the long run, it's one of those things that you hope, like most critical theorists, you want to coin a term. I guess like an example I could use for the desert abstraction is kind of what Timothy Morton calls the hyperobject, right? It's this thing that we can only really grasp at, we can only get pieces of. And so that's why it is all the things you can dream it up to be, but you'll never fully comprehend, right? Or apprehend if you're Whiteheadian. So just like it's kind of been a navigation of language to study critical theory. And more what I'm trying to do with my own scholarship is take what works from that and hope that readers do not have to do too much investigative research that they don't want to do to figure out how I'm using those thoughts. One of the more frustrating aspects of critical theory for me has been the gatekeeping that happens. Because I'm sorry, community, but there's a lot of gatekeepers in the critical theory world. And I get it because you work so hard. There's a lot of people who are dedicated to one thinker, right? Or a couple of thinkers because they were in conversation with each other. And I think that that's a wonderful thing. I think that kind of rigorous engagement is really wonderful. But there is then that danger of you have these thinkers that have whole dictionaries dedicated to themselves. Right. And then you run the risk of not being able to talk to others in other fields. And maybe that's not a concern for some, but I really feel like, especially in the environmental humanities, I feel like it's important to feel like you're going to have an ongoing conversation. These are problems that are affecting all of us just in different ways, in different intensities. And so having a kind of forged or multiple understanding of language vocabulary is really helpful for that, I think.
Nice. All right, wonderful. Thanks so much to Celina Osuna for breaking it down a little bit for us about what critical theory is, its problems, and its promises. And now I want to pass it off to Tyler Tully to tell us about his experience of critical theory and get more specific into the details of what critical race theory is. So I'll pass it along to Tyler.
And then, of course, another part of this is also interest in critical theory. In critical theory, I think, is best done when it is self-reflexive and punches up, right? Like that's the whole point, is to hold power accountable from a certain positionality from within the academy. And this is a very privileged position in many cases, in most cases, right? This is multiple layers of gender and racial and abled and embodied privilege that comes together, sometimes with class, sometimes not with class in the academy. But how do we speak from that position of so much power and privilege to hold privilege and power accountable? And what does that look like? And so for me, I started looking at ways in drawing inspiration from friends and community members that were actively engaged in other processes of knowledge production that were not involved in the academy, right? And this materializes in many different ways and in many different communities. And that's probably what's so powerful about it, is that it's place-based and it's always particular to location. And one of these longstanding phenomenon are anti-colonial, which is to say traditional practices of knowledge that occur in Native communities in what is now the United States. And having grown up in Oklahoma, having been descended from both settler dirt farmers that were involved in the land runs there, and also from, you descended from some of the 5 civilized tribes there, the Chickasaw Nation and Muskogee Creek Nation of Indian Territory, which later became subsumed into the modern state of Oklahoma. I had grown up in a place where extractive oil economies ran the state, and where the tribes were constantly in a hegemonic relationship with the state, where on the one hand, they had to work within the existing infrastructures, but they were always outside of it, right? They weren't allowed in. And so drawing upon those experiences in those communities that I come from, I started to look at these larger questions of power in a different way. And this has been a long-standing, lifelong process, right? I didn't have like one moment of epiphany, but I'm constantly challenged by that interchange in those different types of tensions that develop from where we come from and where we're going, and how do we affect change for the positive from our positionality.
Nice. Yeah, I really appreciate that about your work in general. You know, you're dealing with these like very serious issues of like high theory, but it's very grounded in your experience, your own communities, the traditions that you kind of intersect with in one way or another. And to me, that's really what scholarship is at its best. It has to be about that, right? Otherwise, it's just kind of spinning our wheels and whatnot.
Right.
And, you know, obviously, recently in the United States, critical race theory has kind of become a term I think a lot of people have heard, and maybe they hadn't heard it before. And it's this kind of bogeyman of like the Trump administration.
Mm.
And, so I'm curious if you could say a little bit more for people who might do a lot of work with religion, ecology, these kind of things, but might not really know beyond like bumper sticker definitions or something. What exactly is critical race theory, or how critical theory applies to race and racism?
It's an excellent question, and what a big responsibility to try to answer that. Let me try.
Yeah,
And this
so
is
sorry in
no,
advance.
because I think this is absolutely relevant to the study of religion, and also any study of ecology, environmental humanities, whether that's in the hard sciences or not. Um, I'm in a really interesting position with one ear in the Anglophone like academy and the other in the United States. And I don't consider myself a transatlanticist by any means. Just this poor kid that grew up from Oklahoma. But I am like, just on Twitter, for example, like I see these different overlapping and simultaneous conversations that are happening amongst friends in the UK, and then also friends here in the United States. And this villainization of critical race theory is happening at the same time in both locations. And it's fascinating to watch it happen in real time, in different ways and with different rhetorics, but always in the same interests of power. And this is what critical theory tries to do. It tries to look at the rhetorics that are being incorporated in the interests of power, right? It doesn't assume that knowledge is only neutral, and that knowledge doesn't have a politics of its own, and that it doesn't have a power socially to affect different ends, right? So when we look at critical race theory and the way that it's developing as a discourse, a divisive discourse on the right in both the United States and in the UK, this is ascending at the exact same time as Brexit and the exact same time as the Trump administration, and all the special interests that they account to and that they account for. So what critical, I was so privileged to study critical race theory through the work of Derek Bell first, and then later through Kimberly Crenshaw and others. I grew up in Oklahoma in an evangelical Christian school where my mom taught. And because she taught there, we received a great scholarship to attend. And this school was obsessed with the westward chain of history as it expanded with civilization moving west. And that education gave me a strange familiarity and appreciation of some of our nation's founding documents around exactly who we are and what we're trying to accomplish in the creation of what became the United States. Now, they had a very particular bent of manifest destiny, and that's the lens through which we read these primary documents. Nevertheless, primary documents they were. When I was introduced to the work of Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw and others who are considered the architects of critical race theory, it absolutely made sense to me, because I had been familiar with these other longstanding discourses in the United States that had a history way back to Plymouth Plantation with the separatists in New England, through John Winthrop's City on a Hill, to manifestations that reappeared to counter the Carter administration, and sort of this long history of the ascent of an organized religious right in the United States. Kimberly Crenshaw and Derek Bell and other critical race theorists are lawyers. And when they explain critical race theory, they're not explaining, this high and lofty metaphysics or cosmology of the world. They're talking about the very real effects of our legal structures, where they came from, why they were created, and to what ends they were created, right? So I had already learned about the Whiskey Rebellion, for example, which took place after the Revolutionary War in the United States. And when I learned about, oh wow, there were all these farmers and low country people who were veterans of the American Revolution, and for all intents and purposes, these were founding fathers of the United States. they were upset that the federal government was taxing them without representation.
Right.
And they were upset that they were not allowed to sell their wares, just like the gentlemen settlers who signed the Constitution did. And you know, we saw through the primary sources in literature at the time that the fear that the United States had was that free slaves and Indians would join with these poor whites, and that they would turn the tide of hegemonic power that existed in the colonies at the time, or rather the burgeoning nation of the United States at the time.
Right.
And you know, critical race theory points to episodes like this, and they say, look, like if you just read the laws that are created federally in response to these things, we can see that there's an effective wedge that's driven between free blacks, between poor unlanded tenant farmers who were white, and this sort of forever divided, legally speaking, any real means of joining across that racial divide to upset the hegemony on the frontier. And it's amazing that you know, the critics today who look at there's many more examples I could give, but that's one that stands out. The critics today kind of latch onto that, and they just, you know, they're not reading these people, they're not interested in reading these people, but they are interested in activating you know, certain social groups and powerful interests to do exactly what, you know, critical race theory is pointing out. They are denying cross-racial lobbying efforts and organizing efforts in a way that solidifies power around a particular class of people. And that particular class is not just wealth, it is racial, first and foremost. And when we look at the histories of the United States, it's absolutely undeniable. So when we bring this into the study of religion, right, to bring it home finally, we have to bring that into conversation, right? Like we cannot shy away from these overlapping realities that so define not only the way that we produce knowledge, but the questions that we ask, right? And I think that that's where critical race theory can be very helpful.
All right. Thanks to Tyler Tully and to Celina Osuna. I hope you found both of those discussions as enlightening as I did. And if you haven't heard their full episodes, you can find links to them in this episode and go back and check them out. And if you have heard those episodes, I hope this remix helped provide a new angle on it to maybe stimulate some more thoughts for you and a deeper understanding. So I'll leave it there for now, and we'll be back next week with some more content for you. In the meantime, take care and be well.